I realized that there was no representation of the world to which I belonged. There was a passage to India and there was the Jungle Book. At partition, it was a very small community of Anglophone writing in South Asia, and they got divided, and we had not so many. Literary group he found his band, everything was shut down. So we had those issues we had to face with.
Yeah.
I don't know about the Indians, they're not that criticized for this, but the reason was it doesn't touch politics at all, the early English poetry. What becomes the language in which you can express yourself? And if you studied at school and university, sometimes it becomes your strongest language, because she didn't have that command over Urdu that she did over English. But she was being told that this is your creative language, and that is not. That's just, a useful language.
Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. This is Hasan Zafar on Federal Post. I'm very excited today. I have a very special personality with me, Miss Muneeza Shamsie. Good morning and welcome to Federal Post.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
You are the pioneering anthologizer of Pakistani English literature, including And the World Changed, Contemporary Stories by Pakistani Women, for which you received the Forward Bronze Award in 2008 and the IPPY Gold Award in 2009 in the United States, and you are Pakistan's bibliographic representative for the Journal of Commonwealth Literature and serves on several international advisory boards, including that of the Journal of Post-Colonial Writing. So, how did it all begin for you? Your interest in literature?
Well, it's a bit of a random career, actually, in that way. Unexpected career. I loved reading as a child, and that was just there. Then I went to school in England when I was 9, and I was there, I did my A-levels and all that, and I came home to Pakistan. Now, being in England, I realized that there was no representation of the world to which I belonged. There was a passage to India, and there was the Jungle Book.
Right.
Where did my world fit into this? You learn when you're living in England with Angles, you don't really talk about your homeland and all that much. You just sort of. But this made me seek out books that were about this country. I knew this literature existed because actually my chachi was the novelist Atiya Hussain.
Okay.
So I knew that she had written Sunlight on a Broken Column. She had written Phoenix Fled. But at my school, none of the teachers showed any interest in these books. Today if you're at a British school in Britain and you say, my aunt has written a book, they'll say, tell us about it.
Yes.
But in my school, when my sister and I tried to tell the teacher, they said, oh, what is this book? Never heard of it. So I became very interested. Then I come back to Pakistan, aged 19. And I am absolutely clueless about this place. I came in
10 years in England.
10 years. I came for holidays, and I met my parents in between.
Right.
But 10 years in England. So there was this very Angrez girl, very eccentric, and so I started. I started looking out for. I read Ahmad Ali. I started reading alternative literature. V.S. Naipaul, not necessarily Pakistanis, V.S. Naipaul, R.K. Narayan. I started looking out for these alternatives. Then what happened was that, and that's one of the reasons why I was interested in writing this book, was to show what I had lived through in a way. And then I started to meet these poets, Kaleem Umar and Adrian Hussain, and they were all having poetry gatherings. So then I would go to their poetry gatherings. So I got interested in their poetry, and I realized there was a poetry being written about the world to which we belonged. And then eventually I went into journalism. For a long time I scribbled privately. My husband was very kind. When he found I was serious about writing, he bought me a typewriter. He said, here you are, type away.
Okay.
He was very supportive in that way. He just said, do what you want to do. You want to be social, go and have coffee parties. You want to write. So I wrote. And then my friend said, you've got to take this seriously, you start getting into newspapers. So I contributed a few articles, and they don't ask me to write for them, which is wonderful. I had a wonderful editor, Mr. Muhammad Ali Siddiqui, who discovered my interest in literature. So then he starts pushing me into literary reviews, and I was just saying earlier, I interviewed Hanif Qureshi on his first trip to Pakistan.
And that was in
About 1983.
1983, right.
And then I started reviewing others, people like Hasan.
Shortly after he wrote the Black Album.
No, before the Black Album, he had just, I think he hadn't written Laundrette here, he wrote it here.
Right.
He had just won the George Devine Award.
Right.
He had, for one of his plays, he was
So that is the time, 1983, the experiences that he mostly talks about in his later works.
Yes, I knew his aunt Maki Qureshi was a poet.
Right.
She was the first really major modern woman poet. I knew her, we knew the family. And so she had said, oh, you must meet Muneeza. And so she had invited me to dinner, and I had been sent to interview him anyway.
So were you part of that community that he talks about in Karachi? That when he visited Karachi and people looked at him as an outsider, not as a Pakistani, the experience that he mostly refers back to as an Englishman or a Pakistani diaspora in England.
Well, I suppose maybe that's why we got on, because I didn't think of him as an outsider. I understood this duality that he inhabited. So we hit it off very well, actually, Hanif Qureshi and myself.
Okay.
And later
that was partly because of your own experience of living in England in the 1950s and 60s?
Yes, it's my own experience, of my knowledge of what it was like to... They didn't have any concept of migrants coming in being British or something. And most of the time they were surprised that I spoke English, which was a bit of a shock, because at that time I couldn't speak anything else. So yes, I understood that, and a lot of people questioned my inclusion of him, and even I've seen books about Hanif where they say very firmly he's a British writer. Well, he is a British writer, but you must accept that there are British people with other identities, other existences. That is a part of them.
But that kind of consciousness developed later.
Yes, that was much later.
Yes.
Yes. But he happily contributes to all my anthologies, very happily.
I'm sure he does.
You know.
Yes. People pointed out that not many Pakistanis were writing in English, whereas in India there was a bulk of writing in English. You mentioned R.K. Narayan, for example.
Yes.
A very important writer.
Yes.
So, how do you compare Pakistani literature in English and Indian literature in English? How are these two writings different in relation to their experience of the term you used, their interaction with the colonial world?
Well, I mean, I suppose you've had Indians writing. I mean, Ahmad Ali, for example, is considered the major. I mean, Bruce King describes him as the major force. There was in the Indian writing began to change in the 1930s, and so you had R.K. Narayan, they were it was Raja Rao, who was Ahmad Ali's great friend also, and they were introducing a new voice and it was related to independence, unlike the earlier generation who were using this sort of Orientalist and trying to copy the Brits and all this. What happened was that at partition, it was a very small community of Anglophone writing in South Asia, and they got divided, and we had not so many, because of course, as Muslims, as you know, acquired English later in any case. So we just had Shahid Surawardi, Ahmad Ali, and actually a person who's forgotten who I talked about was Atiya Faizi's husband. He'd written 2-3 novels, he'd written poetry, he'd written fiction. Everyone's forgotten because it's the old style, not Ahmad Ali and all were new. How do I compare the two? Well, so I suppose in India it was much more together, it all took off. In Pakistan, what you had was a lot of writers writing away in English, self-publishing sometimes, but it wasn't up to the mark. So it's really when it starts changing is in the late 1970s, in the 80s, with Bapsi Sitwa and all these people coming to the fore. Bapsi was the first to be published locally, to be published abroad. And that's we're talking about the 1980s, by which time the Indians were sort of taking off on a big scale. It's just that they had a earlier start, I think. But so, I mean, I was thinking in kind of general terms, they both address issues of identity, nationality, politics.
Yes.
So in that way, I don't see them different. Of course, they belong to different societies and different countries. So obviously that shapes your way of looking at things.
Yes.
But there is a kind of interaction also, I think.
But the political line that was created also divided the way literature was done in the two countries. That's what I'm trying to figure out. If you have any thoughts about it?
Well, I think I can talk only about English literature. The way it was done, I suppose in India it was a bigger community. I mean, it was very small, and there was this whole crisis after partition. Why are you writing in English? There was
Yes.
the Angreses have gone. What are you writing this language for?
Right.
And so there was a whole debate. I'm much more aware of the Pakistani side of it than the Indian side. There was this whole debate of this is useless literature, and if you're going to write in English, then you should write only to explain your country to the foreigner. So if you criticized it, then everybody jumped down your throat and said, why are you writing anti? Then of course, we had issues of censorship. There was a famous case of N.A. Farooqui, who wrote, it wasn't a brilliant novel, I think it was called Snakes and Ladders. And he sort of made fun of a recognizable bureaucrat. And his book was banned, the literary group he founded was banned, everything was shut down. So we had those issues we had to face with.
Yeah.
I don't know about the Indians, they're not that...
The way English was looked at and the way English writers were treated in Pakistan, so that maybe had some impact on their writing or on
Yes.
their ability to publish even.
Yes.
Yes.
You see, the other thing that let me tell you about, I mean, we're talking about the 60s and 70s. Now, supposing you write in English in Pakistan, this is before you get involved with diaspora, you're only reaching out to a limited audience. An Urdu writer can defy the odds, and he'll go and stand in front of a huge audience and recite his poems, and he'll get a support. But where will the English writer go?
So it put the English writers on a margin in the society.
Yes, so they actually, the early poetry, it's criticized for this, but the reason was it doesn't touch politics at all, the early English poetry.
The English poetry
By Pakistanis. Although it's very good poetry, but they do not engage in politics.
So what are generally the themes of...
They engage with society, with life, with weather, with social structures, daily life,
But when you are not talking about politics, or when you are not talking politics directly, that also is a political comment
Yes,
that you are not probably allowed to say what you want to say. So you talk about the weather, or you talk about this and that.
Yes, but in the 60s and 70s there was strict censorship. So the English lot were and this was a great criticism against them. But you had to understand this kind of limitations within which they functioned, and even then they spoke. They tried to express themselves.
So we were talking about Pakistani writing in English, and the politics or the political discourse which Pakistani writers avoided when they
in
were
the early
writing
days,
in the early 1950s and 60s.
Yes, in the early days.
Yes, in the early days.
Not in the 50s and 60s. When they did, they got into trouble. So the ones who came to the fore. But I wanted to make one point, is that, we had this discourse, but we had English medium schools and we had English. What happens is, some people are very fortunate to be bilingual or trilingual, but what becomes the language in which you can express yourself? And if you studied at school and university, sometimes it becomes your strongest language. And
True.
I do have a friend who grew up with this view that, oh, you should write, she was, she knew Urdu well, you should write in your own language. But her strongest language was English. And you should write in your own language. The result was she never wrote anything at all. Because she didn't have that command over Urdu that she did over English. But she was being told that this is your creative language and that is not. That's just, a useful language. So that's the other point I'm making about writers, especially the early writers who wrote in English and then asserted their use of this language.
But as I said earlier, it put them on the margin because they were not the main. They were not regarded. Tawfiq Rafat, for example, was not regarded a mainstream writer, or name any other one like Muneeza Shamsie, for example. Other mainstream writers going to Mushaira, so these people were never invited anywhere.
No, they had their own little groups.
Exactly. So it puts them on the same happens to women writers. I've been thinking about this pigeonholing of writers, women writers, South Asian writers. So it automatically puts you in a pigeonhole and therefore on the margin or outside the mainstream. Do you think it is fair with the women writers in that sense if you put them in anthologies like that?
No, I don't think it puts them in the margins. I think it gives them a voice often. What happens is that, by the way, this is something I've noticed, when you've been on a literary journey, and you'll find that the men will go for a particular book and the women will say, no, that's rubbish, by a man, What is this gender bias? What rubbish? And the same thing, or for example, a foreigner will go for a particular book by an Indian or a Pakistani, and the Indian or Pakistani judge will say, what rubbish, is a rubbishy book. So there are these different perspectives. So when you put together a collection of women writing, you're not marginalizing them. You're often giving them a space that, although it has changed, now we've got many more women writers, so gradually these definitions will change. But it was important to give that space. I don't think it marginalized them. It gave them a voice, it gave them a sense of asserting themselves, of moving beyond stereotypes.
So it became part of a political movement at that time.
Well, I suppose, yes, you can call it that.
Yes, in the 1980s especially.
Yes, but 1980s, yes. But the women's political movement is much older.
But you think now things have changed and they're part of the mainstream as much as any other writer. You don't have to categorize yourself as a woman writer from writing in English from Pakistan to be noticed.
No, you're still noticed because the major writers are women.
Yes.
But you get... I think you still need space sometimes for women. I think the struggle for women is harder. And,
do you still think it is, or has it gone better?
The struggle.
The struggle. Or the ability to be noticed or be heard?
Well, that has improved. Much has improved for women. A simple thing, when in the 60s, there were hardly any jobs for women. Actually, I wanted to be a scientist. I was told there are no jobs for women scientists. And now look, there's a Pakistani woman who's a dean of Harvard Science College or something. I get so proud when I see these women scientists. I get so excited. So
did you apply for any science degrees anywhere?
No, I didn't. I didn't have no job for scientists. Anyway, so I had this dream of being a scientist. So in the 60s, there were hardly any jobs for women. Now you've got women heads of firm. So, of course, women have been able to find a space. But, it's still a long battle. We all know this,
What happened to Pakistani literature in the last 20 years? Not just English literature or literature in English, but also Urdu. We don't have writers of that stature as we had before in the 1970s or 80s, if you allow me to make this observation.
Pakistani literature generally?
Generally, yes.
Well, that's a very big project that covers many different languages in which I am not an expert.
No, but generally, we don't see those figures around anymore. We had Faiz Ahmad Faiz, we had Tawfiq Rafat.
But you only become a figure after some time. So there are I think there's a lot of young talent around, which they might not become big figures, but it might take time. But no, I would dispute that. I think there's a lot of talent, and it needs to come, and you become a big figure. Sometimes because of particular circumstances, you come to the fore. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's your collective body of work that is presented. No, I think there's a lot of talent, and yes.
But when we say that there were censorship issues, there were other problems, there were political issues. So in that kind of situation, literature of resistance or literature of standing up against that oppression, that kind of literature comes up. So how do you look at Pakistani literature in that sense?
No, I think Pakistani literature is a very strong sort of subversive, of asserting themselves. I think it is very strong. And I think it will continue. Sometimes it might not be a voice that's been heard currently for one reason or the other, but it's still there. Words, the power of words is something, as we all know, is something amazing. It lives on beyond the time, but may not be heard today, it'll be heard tomorrow. I think a writer worth his salt writes the word as he perceives it, or he or she perceives it.
Yes. So, thank you very much for this wonderful talk today. And thank you very much for watching. I'm sure you enjoyed listening to Ms. Muneeza Shamsie. Take care. Bye-bye. Good afternoon.